everybody, and welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope we're doing well. Today we're doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw the brand new John Krasinski film, the film If, open to $34 million domestically, which is just not good. The film was going into the weekend with projections upwards of $40+ million domestically, coming in well beneath that number, though it seems to have recovered slightly between Saturday and Sunday. The initial estimates going into it after tomorrow's or after yesterday's numbers was around $30 million. It seems now it's ticked up a little bit to $34 million. Even so, that is not nearly enough for a film to be able to be on the right path to break even with the kind of budget that this film has. So let's just say it's not completely out of the realm of possibility for this film to turn things around, but this is a very bad start for a movie like this with the kind of budget that it has. Definitely not the biggest budget that we've ever seen, especially for a film that features a lot of animation and CGI, but it is still one costing enough for it to have to make quite a bit of money worldwide to break even, and it's just not really seeing that kind of number right now. We also have other new releases in Strangers Chapter 1, Back to Black, and also the second weekend numbers for Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, and so we'll talk about where does Kingdom stand in relationship to the other films in the franchise, and do I think the film will make its money back, looking at the actual ticket sales and looking at the actual, I should say more accurately, looking at the understanding that they only get a certain percentage from domestic markets, from international markets, and when you especially take into account those international markets and how much money it is making in those markets specifically, and China especially also having a very large portion to play in that, let's just say the film is not looking nearly as good as it might on paper, and I'll go more into detail about that in just a second. Before we get any further, please make sure you smash that like button, a lot of that fire button over on Aussie, and smash the rumble button as well. Also, make sure that you're subscribed to the channel with that bell notification. That way you know every time a video or live stream goes live on the channel. A blessed Pentecost Sunday to everyone out there. It's a wonderful time to be alive, a wonderful time in the church, and so I hope everyone's season of Pentecost and time after Pentecost goes very well. So we got Tony over at Deadline talking about how Strangers Chapter 1 is a strong at $12 million, whereas Back to Black has gone belly up at $2.8 million in its domestic opening. So we'll talk a little bit about Back to Black also, this being a slightly lower budgeted movie, but still not making nearly as much as it should to break even. We're going to kind of go past Tony a little bit quick today because he doesn't have too many quips in his opening, at the very least in his title. Let's see what he has to say here in the opening paragraphs. The Saturdays were good to If, lifting the picture to a now $34 million opening after $13.6 million on Saturday, which was up against 32%, I should say, against the $10.3 million Friday in previews. That means that CinemaScore word of mouth is working. Okay, so here is Tony just once again trying to make CinemaScore valid and make it work. It's always funny whenever he mentions it, and usually it does not work. Usually there is not actually a very strong correlation. Again, he's using CinemaScore, one, in the way it's not actually said to be intended to be used for, and two, the bigger factor here is CinemaScore is just garbage because you can't actually trust the metrics. All you can say is, oh, you give us a score, you give us a letter, and we have to just trust based off of no actual data, right? You're not telling us how many people you surveyed, what markets you were surveyed in, those kinds of things. Those are kind of important because let's just say if you have a bunch of people who are being talked to and you have maybe 10 who respond and they're all in the LA market, that's going to be very different than if you were to answer maybe the Kansas City market or in the Chattanooga market or in the New York market, right? They're different audiences with different mindsets, with different things. And so not every audience is going to be the same. And so because we don't actually have that data, we can never really truly trust it. But what I can say is that If has been getting a pretty mixed reaction. Again, I've been seeing a lot of people online saying that it's very, very good, that they've been enjoying it. But I've also seen, and I feel like a lot of films are now kind of fitting into this category, especially more original takes. You know, this is a film written by John Krasinski. I don't think that there's any other material that has been based off of. So that's already going to be a somewhat harder sell, especially in a world where ticket prices cost so much, right? The cost of going to the movies, not just even the ticket price, but beyond that, right? Talking about the cost of popcorn and drinks. And if you have families with this is, again, a movie that's oriented towards families, that's going to be a little bit of a harder sell to actually bring them out to be willing to spend that kind of money, especially on something that you don't know for sure is going to be worth that time or not. That all being said, it's going to be very interesting to see how this film does in the long run, because is it possible for If to be able to hold its own, for it to be able to potentially, push back against this bad opening weekend? It's always possible, right? We saw some films, for instance, very different audience for it, but Anything But You, right, or Anyone But You, right, the film with Sydney Sweeney in it from last year, that movie ended up making like 13 plus times its budget compared to its first 2 weeks. It made a crap ton after the fact. So that is absolutely something that can happen, right? Movies can be able to have that effect where the actual word of mouth, not the cinema score garbage that he's talking about, but actual authentic word of mouth can oftentimes promote that. I'm just not really seeing a whole lot of it at this point, really pushing for this movie. All that I've really heard from it from people that I trust is that it's fine, right? It's good, it's fine. And for enough people, that might be enough to go out and see it. For someone like me, I tend to be wanting to see films that are just really worth seeing on the big screen instead of films that, okay, how long will it be until this comes out on Paramount Plus? Do I think it might be worth waiting that long to go see it? I like John Krasinski, but some of the voice actors in the film and the casting of the film because of those voice actors makes me think it might be well worth waiting for. Again, whenever you have a film where Awkwafina is a voice actress, even if it's a small role, I don't really want to go out of my way to go and watch something like that and have to hear that. I think after hearing any of her voice work, especially in The Little Mermaid, I've kind of had my fill of that type of voice. And so anyway, let's go ahead and go to thenumbers.com to actually look at what we have going on. Actually, first, let me go to this one to see what the domestic numbers were. So the number one film domestically this weekend was $35 million to the film If from Paramount Pictures. It's around $8,600 per screen. So again, a fairly decent open as far as just the per theater ratio, but clearly also not as much as what they thought going in, right? Thinking initially $40 million plus for this movie. The fact that it did see a jump on Saturday, though, means this film could actually end up coming in a lot stronger when the actuals come out, right? Keep in mind, these are all estimates, and so the difference between the estimates as of Sunday and the actuals as of Monday, Tuesday, when those numbers are released, sometimes can be a little different. Sometimes they can be very different. In general, though, there's not too much difference between them, but I would not be surprised if the Saturday doing so well, there's that potential for the film to maybe be able to get closer to that $40 million film, $40 million number that initially it was estimated to be. And if that happens, well, then obviously we'll have a lot more to say on this, and it'll kind of change the point I'm about to mention, which is that it seems that a lot of the projections at the box office have been kind of all over the place, right? There's some that have been spot on, there's some that have overestimated, some that have underestimated, and I think really what we're dealing with now is a market where, again, word of mouth not only rules the day, like actual authentic word of mouth rules the day, but also people in general are just a lot more careful with their money, right? They don't want to waste their money on a film that just doesn't seem like is worth the time. That's kind of how I'm feeling towards the second film, the number 2 film this weekend at the box office, which is Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. I really like the Caesar trilogy a lot. When I saw the trailers for this, I thought, okay, it looks fine. The CGI still looks like it holds up to the standard set by the Caesar trilogy, but ultimately, I just did not really care to see this story continued. I thought the Caesar trilogy was good, and I didn't really care about any type of follow-up to that story. I felt like it was fine. You know, the obviously the War for the Planet of the Apes film was not the best ending of the trilogy. It could have been. It was still mostly solid. It was a film that I, have positive remembrances of, but not enough for me to want to say, oh yeah, let's go ahead and hundreds of years into the future and see what's going on with the apes. It's just not something that I have a lot of interest in. That all being said, a 55% drop for a film, right, like this that costs $160 million. Whenever you have a big budget film like that, right, over $150 million especially, whenever you have drops like this, these are very good. Right? And this is something that you may not hear from others. People say 55%, that's huge, right? That's nothing compared to what you saw for the Top Gun Mavericks, right? Which were dropping in the teens, 20s, 30s. But still, for a big budgeted film, and typically big budget films can drop in the 60s, 70s, 80s sometimes, right? What we're seeing here with the 55% means that it's having a pretty fair hold, right? From week 1 to week 2. It's still just not strong enough, though, at least according to my own metrics, for it to be out of the woods yet. It is not quite at the point of a guaranteed break-even profitable movie. And in fact, I would say, and you'll see why in a little bit based on the charting, that this film likely will barely break even, but more likely than not will not break even. And again, it all comes down to where is it making money and how much money does the studio get back in return for that. Now, again, talking here about the individual release and not necessarily of Disney 20th Century Studios, because remember that they are primarily a distributor on this movie. There's a lot of other production companies and persons behind it. And so who is paying what for this? How much are you getting? How much is Disney getting as a distributor versus as a producer? But again, as an individual film, we can absolutely talk about what this film's metrics are, especially in comparison to the others. I think it'll give us a good, fair metric of what's going on there, just in case anyone thinks I'm just hating on the film for the sake of hating on it, and hopefully give a little bit of context of how I feel in general about the franchise, and also where I am as far as just trying to be honest with the numbers as they come in. We have also the new film from Lionsgate, The Strangers Chapter 1 at $12 million, getting $4,000 per screen. This actually came in above projections. I think about a couple $1 million or so above projections. So clearly enough interest in this prequel. I haven't really heard a lot about it, to be honest, though. So it looks like they're getting a very specific audience to see this movie. And typically what we see is a much stronger opening weekend for these horror films and then a pretty large drop-off. So the fact that you're having that for much smaller budgeted films, they can kind of embrace that. They can actually survive a massive drop in week 2. 2 because they cost so little in comparison to others, right? If you see a massive drop off week 1 to week 2 in a film that costs over 150 plus million, okay, that's going to be devastating for them. If you see that kind of a drop though, right, 70, 80% drop for a film that cost maybe $10 million or less, okay, not nearly as devastating if that opening weekend was strong. And in this case, it's again stronger than what even the initial anticipation and the initial thoughts were. The initial projections were. So very cool to see that. And again, haven't seen the film. I know that I really liked the remake of The Strangers that came out in the earlier mid 2000s, which I thought was pretty good. But again, I found myself enjoying it more than I probably should have. I know that it's based off of, there's an original concept of The Strangers, and I'm sure there's some horror fans out there that are huge fans of the original and like, how dare you never see the original? I've also heard that there's just not been as good remakes recently, because there's been a couple, I think, that have come out since that last one that I saw. But overall, it wasn't my favorite. Not enough for me to want to go see this film, for instance, but it's an interesting concept nonetheless. Number 4 film is The Fall Guy. So Fall Guy continuing to fall, but 38%. Again, week 3 dropping in the 30s. That's definitely a much stronger hold than probably it deserves. But because that opening weekend was not very strong, that means that this film still has a long ways to go, and the chance of it breaking even probably will not be happening still. The Challengers film from Amazon, 2.9 million, dropping 33%. So this film also holding quite strong. This film's been doing a lot better than I think anyone would have expected it to, but ultimately, because of the budget being probably higher than what they had thought it would be, as far as the actual raw box office gains, it's not looking like that is happening for this movie. And then the new film, Back to Black, this is the film about Amy Winehouse from Focus Features, opened up to only $2.8 million. Tony says that this is it not doing very well. We'll break down those numbers in just a second. But just to also round up the top 10, we got Taro with $2 million, Godzilla x Kong hanging around with 35% drop there. And again, I've talked about how this film has made money, is making profit. And again, it ultimately comes down to how much profit is, how much money are they actually holding onto from the China-owned corporation, right? Legendary is owned by a Chinese company in the Wanda Group, and we don't know exactly what kind of deal they now have with the Chinese Communist Party, right? It's better than 25% is all that we know. We don't know much more beyond that, and ultimately it's, again, how much of that is going to the Communist Party and how much of it is staying within Legendary as a company to use on future projects. Either way, we're looking at a film that's not making as much profit as it might seem on paper, but again, we don't know that number, so I can't say so for sure. A new film, The Blue Angels, I think it's about the actual Blue Angels themselves. So this is from Amazon MGM, $1.3 million. Seems like a pretty good per theater ratio there, right? Only being out in a certain number of screens. And then rounding up the top 10 is Unsung Hero from Lionsgate. I believe this is a faith-based movie, or there's some aspect of that in this release from Lionsgate. 57% drop in the 4th week of release, so not doing incredibly well at the box office, but also not a film that needed to make a whole lot to break even. And that just reminds me I need to definitely update the numbers and charts, because this is one of those movies that's just not updating in the charts in real time. The metrics that I use for the box office and my charting. So let's go now individually. If making $55 million worldwide means ultimately this film came in well under projections, right? I mentioned before about voice acting. The fact that you have someone like Phoebe Waller-Bridge listed as one of your key voice actors is also something holding me back quite a bit. I love Ryan Reynolds. I love John Krasinski. Steve Carell's great. So there's a lot of reasons for me to want to see the film, and maybe there is enough goodwill that John Krasinski has from his work on even not just The Office. Like some people who are parents might be like, oh, I really liked his performance in The Office. They might also have been fans of his work on the Quiet Place movies, for instance. And so maybe they're like, oh, he's going to be doing work now on a children's film. Maybe I can trust him now. Maybe we're seeing that with the Saturday numbers being a little bit higher. We'll maybe continue to see that if the Sunday numbers end up being higher in the actuals versus the estimates. As of right now, not the strongest of starts. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes is now at $237 million worldwide. So ultimately, this means on paper, using traditional metrics, the film is set to likely break even, right? Using a typical 2.5 multiplier, which is what I use in my main charting, is definitely something that indicates the film is doing well enough to do that, but it's not looking to make mass profits by any means, even according to that chart. But remembering that that chart is using a metric which only really holds if it's making a large portion of that money domestically and a lot more money internationally. That's the reason why this film probably needs to be closer to 3 times its budget to actually be able to hit its break-even point, and it's not looking like that is going to happen. $136 million from the international market, and I don't believe that the numbers, or at least the numbers website has actually designated how much of that's from China, or if the China numbers have actually been reported, because it was at $11 million, I believe, before this video was even being recorded, and so that is definitely a metric. But remember, they only get 25% back, and so it's not going to change all that much as far as where the current standings are, where the film is making money. But we love doing things live here on the channel, so let's go ahead and try to do a little bit of a comparison, because some people might actually be interested to know Okay, what kind of comparisons can we look to? So let's put Dawn for the Planet of the Apes on the screen. Let's put Rise for the Planet of the Apes on the screen, and let's put War for the Planet of the Apes on the screen as well. We'll leave the 2001 off right now because I think that film probably is going to still, especially when you adjust for inflation, just dominate all of the films here. But let's just look at the most recent releases, the Caesar trilogy going back to 2011, and the more recent release from 2014, 2017 up against this movie. So right now, the unadjusted numbers, right, to give you a metric here. On the second Sunday of release, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes is at $8.2 million. That falls against Dawn for the Planet of the Apes, which was at $11 million. Falls even against Rise for the Planet of the Apes, which was at $8.7 million, and even and only beats actually War for the Planet of the Apes, which was at $98 million $98 million domestically by the end of its second weekend. So as of right now, it actually is edging out War for the Planet of the Apes. But remember, these are using unadjusted numbers. So even if inflation drives you crazy, if even the numbers inflation chart drives you crazy, remember, even if you take into account the fact that ticket prices were a lot smaller back even in 2017 versus what they are now, the metric is still valid, right? The same story is still being told, which is that this movie is just not selling as many tickets. Not as many people are going to see this movie, meaning the value of this film, the worth of this film is not as big as some of these other films. So let's go ahead and give these comparisons, right? So as you can see, when you actually take the adjusted for inflation numbers, 101 versus 183, right? 101 versus 143, 101 versus 118. So the film is actually still tracking behind War for the Planet of the Apes when you actually take into account inflation. You could do the same thing also looking at ticket sales, right? Ticket sales for War of the Planet of the Apes is still also going to be a lot higher than what it is currently right now for Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. And if you look at the overall totals, it is starting to get close to the number for War for the Planet of the Apes, right? 8.2 versus the adjusted 7.7. I think a big question is going to be, where does that second Monday go to, right? Its first Monday dropped quite a bit, $4.4 million. So we can expect that to probably be at least, the highest that it could possibly do on its second Monday. You're not going to typically see a second Monday be higher than a first Monday necessarily. So I suspect that it'll probably be in the twos, maybe. And that means that the chances of Planet of the Apes, rather War for the Planet of the Apes, actually edging it out on its second Monday is very, very likely, and it might actually start to catch up even in the unadjusted numbers. So it is going to be interesting to see where that film ultimately falls in its second weekend. But to give you this comparison, it's important to keep in mind, right, with this in mind, that the chances of it getting to the likes of the $580 million worldwide that was made by War for the Planet of the Apes is not very likely. If we go ahead and make the actuals here instead of using the inflation-adjusted numbers, that means also the chances of it getting to even 489 probably aren't all that strong. 470, probably not all that strong. And again, keeping in mind that those numbers are not really accurate to what those films did when you look at ticket sales or things like inflation. Ultimately, we're looking at a film that probably will not be able to make its money or make nearly as much money. And again, we'll go more into detail when we get into the full charting in just a minute. But I did want to give this comparison just so that way people could understand why this film's tracking is not really as strong as it might seem like it is, right? 55% drop sounds really good on paper, but when you think about how much it actually made opening weekend, when you think about where that compares to the other films in the franchise and where those films ended up, right now, it's not looking all that great, especially, again, you look at these international numbers, 136 versus 294, 342, 502. The chances of those international numbers being higher for Kingdom doesn't seem to be very likely at this point. Doesn't seem like it's performing as well in those countries. And again, even if it did, you still have to take into account how much money is received from those countries when you look at the actual return on investment. Looking to The Strangers Chapter 1 at $12 million. Again, definitely bigger than what was being expected. We'll do something similar here because there might be some fans of The Strangers that are out there. So let's go ahead and put this up against The Strangers from 2008. Let's get Strangers Prey at Night 2018. So I thought there was at least one film in between those. All right. So Strangers Chapter 1, $12 million opening is still well below, even unadjusted, The Strangers from 2008. And is above The Strangers Prey at Night. So it seems like it's tracking a little bit better. Maybe it's maybe the word of mouth on this film is stronger than what the Prey at Night film was. I didn't hear great things about The Strangers Prey at Night, but those are when you look at the actuals. Looking at these numbers adjusted for inflation, you can see $12 million versus $31 million versus 12.3. The film, again, even when you take these numbers into account, remembering these adjustments for inflation, remembering also even the average ticket sales, Strangers Chapter 1 is still selling less even than The Strangers Prey at Night, right? So it's again right on pace with it, looks like on paper. We'll see what the actuals come in. If the actuals are even higher than $12 million, maybe it'll even beat out those adjusted numbers for The Strangers Prey at Night, but ultimately is still far below the 2008 Strangers remake, and then again, basically edge to edge, right toe to toe with the film, from 2018. And so again, ultimately better than expected, but still also brings that same story, which is that these movies today just aren't doing as well as the films from the past. The Fall Guy is $127.5 million, according to thenumbers.com, as we're recording this video. Yeah, it's just not doing that well. This is a mediocre film. Again, overall, I enjoyed it, but it's definitely not as good as some of the other films that David Leitch has made. I thought Bullet Train, for instance, was a lot more enjoyable. And again, there's a lot of things to like about the film, but it also felt very incomplete. There were a lot of technical issues that I had with it also. And because they put a lot of money into this, and I appreciate the fact it is a love letter to stunt workers, right, and stunt teams. Fantastic that there's a movie that exists like that. It's not looking like that film is going to be able to make its money back. Challenges at $78 million worldwide. Again, better than what anyone would have expected, but again, I don't think that it's going to make its money back either. All right, let's go to the chart because we love charts here on OMB Reviews. And let's start first off with Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. And so, as I'd mentioned, right now that the 2 weeks have passed, we can make some projections. These are what films typically do after their first 2 weeks. Most films will, at best, double what they've made after 2 weeks. And in worst case scenarios, unusual worst case scenarios, because obviously there's always going to be worse than this and better than this as well. We call those chart breakers. But in general, most films fall in somewhere on this range on the chart. So based on those metrics, it's looking like the film will make somewhere between $339 million and $475 million by the end of its run. The fact that it's dropping around 55% domestically indicates that it's probably going to be closer to that maybe 50% metric or that 60% metric. But even in those cases, we're talking about, again, a worst case scenario on paper using a 2.5 multiplier of $36 million of a loss and a best case scenario of $45 million of a gain. Now, again, that's using that 2.5 multiplier. That means on average, making around $4.3 million. That's not really a whole lot of money. So even if it does make money, it's not going to make a whole lot of it. And then when you take into account where it's making the money, it becomes a little bit more dire. So based on the 2.5 metric, right now the film is said to be around $97 million in the red. But if you take into account, it only gets 40% back internationally, that number jumps all the way to $131 million in the red. So we're talking about a difference of around $30 million or so in what it needs to make back. That $30 million would be enough to likely make out and take out any of the projected profits if it gets closer to that 50% metric. So this is the reason why I'm saying that on paper, there's definitely a chance for this film to be able to make money. There's definitely a chance for this film to be able to break even and to make profit. But if it's going to keep making most of its money, and again, we don't have the adjusted numbers or the up-to-date numbers, I believe, from China yet, so this could obviously change things somewhat. Because of the fact that in that country alone, it only gets 25% back, that's not going to make that much of a difference. And even if you're adding another $10 million to this number here, they're only getting 25% of that. They're only getting $2.5 million of that $10 million, and so that's not really going to change things all that much. So this is why we're going to be continuing to follow this, and obviously I'll be updating my RCC chart when it comes to this movie specifically, because I know a lot of people are interested in whether or not this film is going to succeed or not, especially because this is a Disney release, right? This is from 20th Century Studios. This is one of the first big releases that we get from Disney this year, and many people thought, oh, Disney's back on top, man. Disney is doing so much better than expectations. People were writing them off too soon. And I think that those stories really aren't accurate. They're not representing the actual information and the actual data that we have in front of us. Yes, on paper, the film doing better than expected. No doubt about that. No one can question that. It's doing better than expected. But doing better than the other films in the franchise, even for more recent years? No. And in many cases, not even close, especially if you were to look at ticket sales. Doing better as far as the overall range of projections, $475 million in a top range projection, meaning, hey, if the film does even better than expectations, maybe it gets to $500 million. Well, no, again, because of the films that we have set to come out still this year, I don't think that it's going to be able to have enough room to dominate the box office. And you all know, I don't think competition alone is going to determine whether a film succeeds or not. It can sometimes make things harder, especially when people are a lot more picky with their movies or if people are only waiting to see specific films come out. But ultimately, I think there's a lot of things that are kind of going against what is currently going on, right? To give you an idea, coming up this weekend, we have Furiosa, Mad Max Saga, right? Not a film that's still going to be typically seen as a big moneymaker, right? When we look at even the Mad Max Fury Road film, wasn't the biggest box office hit in the world, right? It didn't really make a lot of actual profit. But there is clearly an audience for it, and I think there's a lot of interest surrounding this movie. I know I have interest in it. I think the character Furiosa is interesting. I think that calling it a Mad Max Saga is a bit disingenuous, just like calling Mad Max Fury Road was disingenuous because that was not a Mad Max movie. That was a Furiosa film, so it's like this should be called Furiosa 2 or Electric Boogaloo or something like that, right? But it's still going to make a lot of money. I think that it's going to, comparatively to The Weeknd, right? I think it's going to end up winning. the box office weekend, or it has a chance of maybe getting second place to a film like the Garfield movie from Sony, which I think will probably end up dominating. That's why If has a lot of reasons to be nervous, because it's doing better, right, on the Saturday, Sunday. So it seems like maybe there's some word of mouth, or maybe it's just, hey, Saturdays and Sundays are going to be much bigger for families than a Thursday, Friday, and this movie's clearly oriented towards kids. But that also means the tracking is going to be kind of all over the place. So who knows what happens next weekend. But Garfield, Furiosa, all this going back, what I was saying before about Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, means that there's going to be a lot of area in that audience, right, that PG-13 rated R audience that's going to be more interested in a film like Furiosa or like Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes are going to have other options to go to. You also have a new film from Angel Studios site, which I have an early copy of. I still need to watch it, and I will give an early review of that. Make sure you follow me over on Critic List if you want to have instant access to reviews. Hopefully, now that summer is back around, I'll try to be able to actually record video reviews again for the channel, but things have been kind of hectic and crazy with the end of the year, and also, of course, with family. But I want to give that update there on Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. With movies going now to, because that's the only real projections we can make, as you can see with Fall Guy, still 118 million in the red. It's just not looking like that's going to happen. The film Taro is actually reached a point of profitability, so it looks like it's following exactly where it was projected to. Challenges is still at 35 million in the red, so it's still performing, on average at this point, right? And it might be able to get a little bit further down versus its first 2 weeks, but again, cost a little bit too much on paper for it to actually be able to make that money back. But going now to the new releases, right? Remember that typically a lot of films make 30% of their entire box office, their worldwide box office, in their opening weekend. So using that metric, we can say that If has a chance of getting to maybe $150 to $200 million at this point, right? Obviously, after week 2, we'll be able to make much more accurate projections on what the film likely will make. But 150 to 200 sounds on paper like it'd be okay. Problem, though, is that the film costs 110 to make. And that means the film needs to make 275 at least. Remember, a lot of it's coming now from international markets, meaning that 2.5 is not as accurate as it once was. And because of that fact, it means that a lot more money needs to be made domestically, or at the very least needs to be made a lot more internationally to make up for that 40% return that you only get from those international markets. And so based off where the money is right now and where it's doing and how it's performing, not likely going to get to that mark. Again, at this point of the release, it's at 132 million in the red, and I doubt that will change all that soon. So it makes me sad just to see a John Krasinski film not do well, but again, it does make sense to me when you think about the kind of movie that it is, being original, and where people's minds are typically when it comes to spending their money. The Strangers Chapter 2, if we do the same type of metric, again, with smaller films, especially smaller horror films, the metric may not be as reliable because there's typically not a big international presence on a lot of these films necessarily. So 12 times 3 means that the chances of it breaking even pretty strong, right? That would put it in that $36 to $40 million range. So that would be more than enough to break even, make a little bit of profit. So kudos to them for doing that. But still, we look at these numbers and think, hey, the same story is essentially being told, which is that the vast majority of films that get released are losing money, right? The vast majority of the films are losing a lot of money, a decent amount of money, or are in a situation where when you actually look at the international sales, are probably not as successful as it might seem like on paper. Like you look at the film Imaginary, it made 4.9 million, so it probably made some money back because it was a much smaller budgeted film, but if it had any international presence, that means ultimately that profit margin gets cut into, right? The same can be said for a lot of the other films that we see on this chart here. And so if you want further analysis on this, you can of course check out my website, ombreviews.com. You have the full chart there. I try to keep it as up to date as I possibly can. It's kind of fallen behind a couple weeks now, but I do have an updated chart. It's the second chart you see on the page. The first chart is the one that I can actually freeze the columns for. I can't do that for some reason. It's basically a difference between Excel versus Google Sheets. You can have a frozen a column where you can keep on seeing the movie. A lot of people like having that access. With Excel, you can't do the same thing with Sheets. Again, I can do it within Sheets, but on a website when it's being published to it, it for some reason just does not work that way. But anyways, the second chart is the one that's the most up-to-date. It's the one that I'm using right here. The first chart is the one that I try to update as much as I possibly can. So you can follow me there. Also, you can follow me on geeksandgamers.com, where I recently put an article out this week, just a couple days ago, going further into Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes and why I think the film has a long way to go and probably not the best chance of actually breaking even or hitting its profits, right? So I just wanted to get that out there, that I will have an article up sometime today or tomorrow, probably be today because we were able to work something out to be able to get those up faster. But if you want further analysis of that, make sure to check out the articles on geeksandgamers.com. What else thoughts about this? Do you think that If is going to be able to survive? Do you think that its stronger showing on a Saturday and Sunday seems to indicate that families might actually be very interested in this movie? And because we're now entering into summer season, so more people off from work, maybe we see the film do better during the week than we would have seen previously. Maybe we see it do much better on the weekends versus the weekdays because of when people have time off. That could be happening, of course. So let me know your thoughts on that. Also, The Strangers, do you see that film? Do you like that? Do you think it's going to be able to kind of hold up to the films, the previous films? And then last, of course, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. Do you think this film is going to make money? Do you think that's going to be able to be a huge box office hit? Based off of these numbers right here, right, we're not seeing the biggest release in the world, especially not only compared to the other films in the series, but also remembering how much they get back in their return on investment from those different markets. As I mentioned, right, this might not be a financial loss for Disney, though, because as primarily a distributor on this movie, they do get some money from that alone as being the distributor. And every time I try to find the list of production companies for this movie, there are several production companies listed, so they might actually be able to come away from this film unscathed, maybe even claim some profit, but on its own as an individual film based on the money that was put into it, not looking like it's going to be a huge moneymaker. So let me know your thoughts about that as well. And anything else I mentioned in the comment section down below. If you like this video, smash that like button, line up that fire button, Aussie, and smash the rumble button as well. You guys are all amazing, and beautiful people, have a wonderful rest of your day, a blessed Pentecost, and as always, God bless. And now for a huge special shout out to all of my May supporters at the Chosen of Valhalla level, starting off with my Patreon supporters, Father Luca Illick. Hail to you, Father. Rosetta Allen, check out her YouTube channel, which is Eagle Rider. And also Miss Martin Muses, check out her YouTube channel by the same name. To my Subscribe Star peeps, starting off with Matt317, check out his Twitch channel by the same name. And ZK-Man, check him out over at xtheboundaries.co. And also, lastly, to my YouTube member at the Chosen of Valhalla level, Mr. Roy, who is, of course, awesome, as all of my Chosen are amazing. If you want your name shouted out at the end of every live stream and video, make sure to check out the top link in the video description below. You can also get access to things like exclusive podcasts and giveaways. I do a giveaways channel on Discord if you are a member at the Keeper of the Bifrost level and above, and a ton of other stuff. So check out more information about that in that top link below. You guys are all amazing, and beautiful people, have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.